So, I mean, we've all been there with our tech, right? Your phone starts lagging, apps are just crashing for no reason, the battery drains in like an hour.
Yeah, and you just get to that breaking point.
Exactly. You reach this point where you realize you can't just keep force quitting the apps or, I don't know, buying a new case. You need a complete system update.
Or honestly, sometimes you just need an entirely new operating system because the old architecture just can't handle the complexity of whatever new software you're trying to run.
Right. You can't run a hyper-connected, high-speed global network on, dial-up infrastructure.
No, of course not. It just collapses.
But what fascinates me, and it's kind of a terrifying fascination, to be honest, is that while we intuitively get this about our phones and our laptops, we seem completely blind to it when we look at human civilization.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, we're trying to run this massively complex globalized society on philosophical and economic operating systems that were coded centuries ago.
Yeah.
And we see the system crashing, right?
Yeah, we see the lag everywhere.
Yeah.
Exactly. Massive wealth inequality, psychological burnout, these endless geopolitical conflicts, ecological disaster. And what do? We just keep hitting the societal restart button.
Hoping that, like, a slightly different politician or a tiny policy tweak will just somehow patch the core bugs.
Yeah, we treat these huge architectural failures like they're just temporary glitches. And that profound systemic failure is exactly where we're starting today.
It's a big one.
It really is. So, welcome back to another deep dive. We are speaking directly to you, the listener, the learner. You're here because, well, you want to get past the surface level noise of the daily news cycle.
Right, you want the root causes.
Yeah, you want to explore the big ideas without just drowning in, impenetrable academic jargon. So today we're opening up a stack of sources that offer a massive, undeniable paradigm shift.
A total rewrite of the code, basically. Literally. We're looking at translated philosophical texts, extensive exegesis, and analytical notes that give this comprehensive summary of a very specific historical text. Specifically, Surah Aal-e-Imran, which is the 3rd chapter of the Quran.
And, looking around at the aesthetic we've got going for this deep dive, this blend of dusty ancient library archives merging right into digital holographic star charts, it really sets the perfect tone.
It totally does.
Because the authors of these notes are taking an ancient revelation and subjecting it to this startlingly structural, almost scientific analysis.
Right, and our mission today is to unpack that radical reinterpretation. And I'm using the word radical deliberately here.
Oh, it definitely is.
Because the sources we have in front of us argue something that's going to fundamentally challenge how a lot of people view religion as a concept. They argue that this surah is not a collection of private religious rituals.
Right, it's not a self-help manual.
Exactly. It's not for personal spiritual comfort. The authors argue that it is instead a blueprint for a unified, scientifically advanced, and socio-economically equitable global order.
The basic premise is that it presents a constitutional framework for a fully sovereign society, one that operates on objective laws rather than human whims.
Now, before we really wade into the deep end here, I need to establish a very clear framework for how we're approaching this.
Yeah, this is important.
Because the text we're exploring today contains some blistering socio-political and economic critiques. I mean, the authors aggressively condemn modern capitalism, they completely reject wealth hoarding, and they outline these heavily state-driven economic models.
It's intense.
Very intense. So whether you're listening to this from a left-leaning perspective, a right-leaning perspective, or anywhere in between, some of this is going to sound incredibly provocative.
And our role here is just to be impartial tour guides.
Precisely. We aren't here to endorse a political ideology or tell you what economic system you should believe in. We are simply unpacking the architecture of the author's arguments, conveying the ideas exactly as they're presented in the original material.
Because, understanding their perspective on its own terms is really the only way to grasp the magnitude of the argument. You kind of have to temporarily suspend your modern assumptions about where religion ends and politics begins.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even start with a paradigm shift this big? Like, if I'm used to thinking of religion as something I just do on a Sunday morning or a Friday afternoon, how do I bridge the gap to this idea of an objective global operating system?
Well, we start exactly where the authors begin, which is with a pretty brutal dismantling of our modern vocabulary.
Okay, lay it on me.
The whole core argument hinges on the distinction between two Arabic terms, Mazhab and Deen. The texts argue that Islam has been tragically misunderstood by the modern world and honestly, even by its own followers by being reduced to what they call a mazhab.
And mazhab translates to what exactly?
In their translation, Mazhab essentially equates to our modern concept of religion.
Got it. So a Mazhab is like the private ritualistic stuff.
Yeah.
The dogmas, the incense, the private prayers, the things you keep quietly in your house.
Right, exactly. You perform your rituals, you get that sense of personal peace, and then you walk outside and just participate in whatever economic or political system happens to be running the country.
But the authors are saying that's wrong.
They argue that treating this text as a mazhab isn't just a translation error, it's a fatal corruption. Surah Aal-e-Imran, according to the exegesis, does not outline a mazhab, it outlines a deen.
A deen.
Yeah.
And how are they defining that?
A deen is described as a comprehensive socio-economic and political constitution. It is this all-encompassing system of life that governs public affairs, economics, law, social interaction, all of it.
Okay, let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. It's like having this massive state-of-the-art supercomputer, but you're exclusively using it as a digital clock on your nightstand.
Yes. That's a perfect analogy.
Like you have this incredible processing power designed to run a smart city, and you're just using it to wake you up at 7 a.m.
That analogy hits the absolute core of their critique. The authors point out that throughout history, the concept of the deen was hijacked by traditional priesthoods and, monastic classes.
Oh, interesting. So the clerics took over.
Right. And by transforming this constitutional operating system into just a series of mystical private rituals, those classes effectively removed the objective legal framework from the public sphere.
They neutered its socio-political power.
Exactly. They completely defanged it.
I mean, I can totally see why a ruling class would want that.
Mm-hmm.
If the divine law only applies to what I whisper in the dark when I'm sad, then the kings and the dictators and the wealthy elite are completely free to invent their own laws to run the actual society.
It is incredibly convenient for those in power if faith is just a private comfort.
It really is. But wait, what happens to the concept of God in all this? In a deen versus a mazhab, does the theology actually change?
It totally redefines the concept of sovereignty. So in a traditional religion, God is often viewed as the supreme entity you petition for personal favors, right?
Right, like please give me health or wealth or good harvest.
Exactly. But in the deen outlined by these sources, true divine sovereignty is a concept called Tawheed. And the authors interpret Tawheed structurally.
Structurally, what does that mean?
It means submitting solely to the objective, permanent principles provided by God.
Ah, so it's less about bowing to a king in the sky and more about adhering to an immutable constitution.
Yes, and the sources are adamant on this. True Tawheed requires the absolute rejection of any societal system where human beings impose self-made laws to subjugate other human beings.
Wait, let's pause on that word. Subjugate.
Yeah.
Are we saying that if I live in a society where, I don't know, a monarch or a corrupt legislative body makes laws that exploit people, participating in that system is a violation of Tawheed?
According to the text, yes, absolutely.
Right.
No human has the inherent right to make another human their subject. The objective divine law is supreme over everyone, morally.
I'm struggling to see how this doesn't just turn into a theocracy, though. Because historically, when people claim to enforce quote-unquote divine law, it usually just means a group of powerful clerics telling everyone else what to do, which is still humans subjugating humans.
Right, and the authors actually address that head on. They argue that a theocracy run by clerics is just another form of human subjugation wearing religious clothing.
Oh, so they reject the clerics too.
Totally. The text insists that the law must be objective and universally applied, not subject to the whims of some priestly caste. And they bring in a specific textual detail to illustrate this from verse 3.103 of the Surah.
What does the verse say?
It commands the people to hold fast to the rope of Allah.
The rope. That's a very physical grounding metaphor. It implies something you can actually grab onto, an anchor.
And the sources interpret this rope as that objective divine law, the constitutional framework of the Deen. And they derive a pretty severe warning from this metaphor.
Which is?
Well, if there is only one objective rope, you must have absolute structural unity. Therefore, the text explicitly equates dividing the community into religious sects or political factions with shirk.
Wait, shirk? That's usually translated as polytheism, right? Like worshiping multiple gods.
It is. But look at the mechanism of what polytheism actually does in a society. If I follow the god of the harvest and you follow the god of war, We have different loyalties. We have different subjective laws.
We're fractured.
Exactly, we're fractured. And the authors argue that forming sectarian divides or partisan political factions is the exact same crime. It destroys the unified constitutional order.
That is a staggering reframing. Sectarianism, which is basically the defining feature of modern religious and political life, is treated as a crime on par with idolatry.
Yeah, they pull no punches.
I mean, it makes sense logically. If your goal is to build a unified sovereign society, you can't have everyone retreating into their own ideological echo chambers. You can't have 5 different versions of the law depending on which tribe you belong to.
Right. And the sources warn that this kind of division inevitably brings what they call divine punishment. But, and this is key, they don't mean lightning bolts from the sky.
They mean consequences.
Yeah, the natural structural consequence of national disgrace and societal collapse. A divided house just cannot stand against external pressures or internal corruption.
Okay, so we've established the macro level here. No sects, no factions, just absolute structural unity based on an objective constitution. But an operating system is only as good as the hardware it runs on, right?
Yeah, true.
If this Deen is going to govern a society, it first has to understand the individual human being. So how do these sources conceptualize the individual?
They introduce this fascinating dualistic view of human existence, and your hardware-software analogy is actually a great way to look at it. According to the text, a human being is not a monolith.
Okay, so what are the parts?
We consist of a biological body and a potential self, or personality, which they term the nafs.
Let's break those down. The biological body is the hardware. The flesh, the bones, the nervous system.
Right, and the biological body is governed entirely by unchangeable physical laws. It requires material sustenance. It needs calories, hydration, shelter, sleep.
Makes sense.
And what the sources emphasize here is the absolute impartiality of these physical laws. The laws of biology and physics apply equally to everyone.
Meaning, gravity doesn't care if you're a saint or a serial killer. If you jump off a roof, you're going to break your legs.
Exactly.
A virus doesn't, check your theological credentials before it infects your cells.
No, it doesn't. The physical world is ruthlessly objective. You cannot pray away dehydration. You just have to drink water. But human existence diverges from purely animalistic life because of that second component, the nafs, the potential self.
The software, the consciousness, the personality.
Yes, and the sources are very specific about the needs of the nafs. Just as the biological body requires material food, the nafs requires nourishment too. But obviously, you cannot feed your personality a sandwich.
Right, it can't grow on material calories. So what is the nutritional content for the nafs? How do you feed a non-material self?
It requires non-material permanent values to flourish. The texts argue that practicing these values is the actual mechanical process by which the human personality evolves and reaches its conscious potential.
Permanent values sounds a bit vague, especially today when we tend to treat morality as highly relative or subjective. Did the authors actually pin down what these values are?
They did. The specific permanent values translated from the text include truth, which is sadaqat, honesty, or diyanat, trust, amanat, selflessness, isar, and honor, hamiyat.
Let's pause on selflessness, Isar. I really want to understand the mechanism here. How exactly does giving up your own advantage feed this intangible nafs? Like, why isn't selfishness just a better evolutionary strategy?
The sources explore the psychology of this deeply. If someone prioritizes immediate material benefits over these permanent values, say they cheat to gain wealth, or they lie to protect their status, they're successfully feeding their biological body.
Right. They get the money, they buy the food, they're physically safe.
But because the nafs isn't getting its necessary food of truth or selflessness, it literally begins to disintegrate.
So they are biologically thriving but psychologically starving.
Exactly. And the text describes the consequence of this starvation as a hellish state of profound psychological anguish. It refers to it as a living death.
A living death, wow.
Think about the mechanism of extreme selfishness. When you are entirely selfish, your psychological world shrinks to the boundary of your own skin. You become paranoid, isolated, constantly defensive because you view everyone else as a threat to your biological accumulation.
You're stunted at an animalistic level.
Right.
That paints a really vivid picture. The living death is that internal void, the anxiety and conflict that comes from realizing you have everything material, but your actual self is hollow.
To avoid this, to fortify the self, the sources say you must protect these permanent values, even if it requires enduring physical hardships or sacrificing material interests.
Meaning, you choose to tell the truth, even when it might cost you your job. You choose to act with trust and honor, even when being deceptive would put way more money in your bank account.
Yes.
They're literally willing to sacrifice the comfort of the hardware, the biological body, to ensure the software, the NAFs, continues to upgrade and evolve.
The growth of the human self is driven entirely by that conscious friction, that sacrifice.
And here is where the connection between the individual and the society becomes unavoidable. If the individual's ultimate evolutionary goal is to protect and grow their NAFs through selflessness, trust, and honesty.
Right, then logically, this society's macro structure has to support that.
Exactly. You cannot demand that citizens act selflessly if the state's economic system mathematically rewards extreme selfishness and exploitation. It creates an unbearable cognitive dissonance.
And that realization forms the bridge to what is arguably the most explosive and radical part of these sources, the economic model.
Okay, let's get into it.
The exegesis of Surah Aal-e-Imran maintains an intense, laser-like focus on economics. The text argues that the society must implement a specific economic system called Nizam-e-Rububiyat.
Nizam-e-Rububiyat. And that translates to
It's a system of universal nourishment.
a system of universal nourishment. Given what we just discussed about the body needing material food and the NAFs needing selflessness, that name carries a massive amount of weight. How does this system actually function?
Well, the texts initiate this concept with a blistering condemnation of modern economics. They specifically target capitalism, the hoarding of wealth, and usury, which the text calls riba.
Riba.
And the authors do not frame these practices merely as inefficient fiscal policies. They label them as a literal war against the divine order.
A war against the divine order. That is an absolute rejection of the status quo. I mean, if accumulating capital and charging interest is seen as an act of war, what is the alternative architecture they're proposing?
The alternative is a macroeconomic structure built entirely on a concept called infaq. The foundational idea is that an individual should keep their surplus wealth, what the text terms alaf, open and flowing into the society.
Flowing. That implies constant movement. It's an economy modeled on a river, not a reservoir.
Precisely. The accumulation and stagnation of capital is viewed as the ultimate enemy of the system. Wealth must circulate continuously.
So no one is just sitting on a pile of gold.
Right. And by ensuring this flow, the state takes on the absolute responsibility of guaranteeing the nourishment, welfare, and basic biological needs of all individuals within the society.
Okay, let me push back on that a bit, because to a modern ear, this sounds like a utopian pipe dream, or maybe a recipe for a massive bureaucratic welfare state. How does an economy actually survive if no one is allowed to build up massive private reserves of capital for investment?
What's fascinating here is that the sources address the psychology and mechanism of value differently. They look at the accumulation of wealth not as a sign of economic health, but as a symptom of psychological disease.
Oh, interesting.
They use incredibly vivid imagery in the exegesis of verse 3.180 to explain this. People who hoard wealth often believe it provides them with security, power, freedom. But the text states that hoarding is an evil.
An evil.
It says that on the day of resurrection, that hoarded wealth will literally become a shackling collar around their necks.
Let's analyze that metaphor. A shackling collar. How does hoarding wealth practically enslave someone?
Think about the socio-economic reality of hoarding. If you accumulate a massive surplus, your life must fundamentally change to protect it. You build higher walls, you hire guards.
You lobby political factions to pass laws that protect your assets.
Exactly. You become deeply suspicious of the people around you. Suddenly, your entire existence is dictated by the maintenance and defense of your hoard. The wealth you thought was giving you freedom is the very thing imprisoning you. It is the shackling collar.
And from a systemic perspective, taking all that surplus out of the flowing river of the economy means someone downstream is dying of thirst. You are feeding your biological desire for security by starving someone else's biological need for survival. Which brings us right back to the NAFs.
Exactly the point the authors make. They view economic exploitation and hoarding not just as civic crimes, but as spiritual failures that actively disintegrate the NAFs.
Because the self requires selflessness to grow.
Right, and hoarding is the zenith of selfishness. Therefore, a billionaire hoarding assets is not a successful human being. According to the text, they are a severely stunted, psychologically disintegrated individual.
It totally flips the metric of success. And I imagine this ties directly into their prohibition of usury, or riba.
Yes. The sources reference verse 3.130, which strictly prohibits riba. Earning money simply by lending money without contributing any productive labor or sharing in the actual risk of enterprise is seen as the ultimate stagnation.
Because it stops the flow.
It stops the flow of infaq. It concentrates wealth without producing real value, which breaks the system of nizam-e-rububiyat.
So the Deen demands action. It demands flow, continuous movement, and equity. But here is the critical problem. If you build a state that guarantees the basic needs of everyone through universal nourishment, doesn't that inherently breed passivity?
That's the classic critique, yeah.
Right. If I know the system or God is going to provide for my biological needs, why wouldn't I just sit around and wait for my share? You can't run a flowing, dynamic economy if the population is completely passive.
Which is precisely why the sources immediately pivot to dismantling the theological concept of fatalism. A passive population would destroy the Deen. To counter this, the text introduces the unyielding principle of mukafa'i-amal, the law of retribution.
The law of retribution. That sounds intensely punitive. Does it just mean God is going to punish you if you're lazy?
Not in a magical lightning bolt sense. Mukafa'i-amal simply means that the universe operates on established, immutable laws of cause and effect. The sources violently reject passive fatalism.
So none of that it was written stuff if things go bad.
Exactly. The traditional idea that your destiny is arbitrarily predetermined, that you're poor because God willed it, or you're oppressed because it's a divine test, and you must simply sit and accept your lot in life, is viewed by the authors as a massive, destructive corruption of the text.
So it's stripping away the comfort of saying, it is what it is, or everything happens for a reason.
The text forces radical accountability. The sources redefine what God's will, Mashiach, actually means in this context. It does not refer to an entity making arbitrary, unpredictable decisions on a daily basis.
So what is God's will then?
God's will is the established, unchangeable laws of nature. Gravity is God's will. Thermodynamics is God's will. Because these laws are fixed and objective, human beings are entirely responsible for their own actions and the natural outcomes of those actions.
Okay, let's look at the implications of that, because it fundamentally disrupts traditional religious practice. If everything is strictly cause and effect, if the physical laws of the universe are impartial and fixed, what happens to the concept of prayer?
Yeah.
I mean, if I want to find a cure for a disease and I sit in a room passionately praying for healing, but the law of cause and effect dictates that I need a laboratory, a microscope, and clinical trials, doesn't the law of mukafa'i-amal render the prayer entirely useless without the physical work?
The authors address this apparent contradiction brilliantly by redefining traditional theological terms. They look at the concept of tawakkul, which translates to trust in God.
Okay.
In the corrupted Mazhab view, trust often means sitting idly and waiting for divine intervention. But in the Deen, tawakkul is only valid after an individual has made full, exhaustive, practical preparations according to the laws of nature.
It's the old proverb, right? Trust in God, but tie your camel.
But the text takes it further. You tie the camel, you check the tensile strength of the rope, you ensure the post is deeply rooted in the ground, you build a perimeter fence, and only then do you have trust that the established laws of cause and effect will hold.
Wow. And what about dua, actual prayer?
The texts argue that dua is not a magic spell or a chant to bend the laws of physics. Prayer is defined as an intense, focused inner desire that must be paired with a relentless, practical struggle.
So you can't just wish for things.
Right. If you pray for a bountiful harvest but refuse to study soil chemistry or plant the seeds, you are in violation of objective law.
The sources actually ground this in a massive historical event, right? There is a specific battle detailed in Surah Aal-e-Imran that serves as the ultimate case study for this lack of magical intervention.
Yes, the exegesis spends significant time analyzing the Battle of Uhud, which is referenced throughout verses 3.121 to 129, and again in 3.152. This was a critical historical moment where the early Muslim community, led by the Prophet himself, suffered a devastating military defeat.
Which logically raises a massive theological crisis for the people involved. I mean, if they are the believers fighting for the divine law and they are literally being commanded by the Prophet, why didn't God just miraculously intervene? Why didn't angels swoop down and win the battle for them?
And the sources use the text to answer that question with chilling clarity. Because the believers violated the strategic physical laws of warfare.
Really, how so?
During the battle, a contingent of archers abandoned their tactical high ground to collect spoils of war. The text explicitly states that their defeat was the direct mathematical consequence of this strategic failure. It was not because God mysteriously withdrew his favor or decided to test them with a loss.
The physics of the battlefield are totally indifferent to theology.
Exactly. The physical laws of warfare, maintaining the high ground, discipline, formation, logistics, apply to everyone equally. An arrow fired by an enemy will pierce the armor of a believer just as easily as it pierces a non-believer if the believer steps out from behind cover.
The law of cause and effect does not play favorites.
It absolutely doesn't.
That removes all the theological safety nets. It's a staggering level of accountability. If your society is failing, you can't blame mysterious divine forces. You have to look at your supply chains, your economic policies, and your adherence to objective laws.
Yep, it's all on you.
I remember the authors even drew a parallel from this ancient battle to the modern era, specifically referencing the Pakistan movement.
Right, the author utilized that modern historical illustration to prove that the principle remains active. Success for any nation, movement, or society relies on a profound psychological transformation and strict adherence to the laws of cause and effect, not merely relying on a religious label or identity.
Nature doesn't care what you call yourself.
No. Nature's laws do not oppress humans. As the text points out in verses 3.117 to 119, humans wrong themselves by stubbornly ignoring those laws.
You know, this extreme reliance on objective law over magical intervention creates a massive shift in how we view leadership. If the system is just a set of objective, impartial laws, then the focus has to shift entirely away from the individual leader and onto the Constitution itself.
It's a necessary pivot, yeah.
And this is most powerfully illustrated in how the Surah addresses the prophet in the aftermath of that very battle.
This brings us to a structural pillar of the text: system over personality. The sources highlight verse 3.144, which was revealed during the chaos of the defeat at Uhud, when rumors were swirling that the prophet had been killed in combat.
Oh, man. You can imagine the absolute panic. The community thinks the leader is dead, the conduit to the divine is gone, the entire movement is over.
But the verse forcefully interrupts that panic. It states, "Muhammad is but a messenger. If he dies or is killed, will you turn back on your heels?"
Wow.
The exegesis zeroes in on this moment as proof that the Deen is an objective operating system. It relies absolutely on the rule of law, not on a cult of personality. The law is supreme, not the man delivering it.
In a standard dictatorship or a cult of personality, the leader is the law. Whatever they say goes, and if they die, there's usually a massive power vacuum or a total collapse. But here, the sources are arguing that no human being, not even a prophet receiving revelation, has the right to act as a sovereign dictator over other humans.
To cement this anti-authoritarian structure, the sources point to verse 3.159, which mandates a constitutional practice called shura, or mutual consultation.
Wait, the text commands the prophet to consult the community. Even though he is the designated messenger of the revelation, he isn't allowed to just make unilateral public decisions.
The command is explicit. He must consult them in matters of public affairs. The authors argue this proves the system is designed to operate on collective intellect and objective law.
Because if it were a dictatorship, consultation would be pointless.
Exactly. If the system were intended to be a dictatorship, even a benevolent one, consultation would be a meaningless charade. The Deen requires the collective brain power of the society to figure out the best practical ways to implement the permanent values within the bounds of physical laws.
And when we talk about the collective brain power, when we talk about who is included in this constitutional equality, the sources make a very clear, uncompromising point.
Yes. The texts end Surah Aal-e-Imran with a definitive statement on absolute gender equality. They reference verse 3.195, which establishes that men and women are fundamentally equal within this system.
And we aren't talking about like equal but different in a patronizing separate spheres kind of way. We are talking about fundamental structural equality.
The text emphasizes that men and women are evaluated by the exact same laws of life, death, and retribution. And most importantly, returning to our earliest point, both genders possess the exact same biological hardware and the exact same potential to develop their nafs.
There's no spiritual ceiling based on gender.
None at all. There is no systemic hierarchy. Both are equally required to participate in the practical struggle, and both are equally nourished by the economic system of infaq.
So let's look at the immense structure we have built so far. We have an objective constitutional law. We have an equitable economy flowing with surplus wealth that outlaws hoarding.
We have a total rejection of fatalism in favor of rigorous cause and effect accountability.
We have a system that outlives its leaders, demands collective consultation, and enforces absolute equality. So, what is the ultimate trajectory of all this? What is this operating system actually designed to build?
The sources argue it is designed to build what they call a heavenly society right here on Earth, a still of continuous peace, prosperity, and unhindered human evolution.
Right here on Earth.
Yes. But achieving this requires the perfect, delicate symbiosis of two incredibly powerful forces, human intellect and divine revelation.
Heaven on Earth. Not just enduring suffering while waiting for an afterlife, but engineering paradise in the present. How does the interplay of intellect and revelation actually accomplish that?
Well, the sources explain that the human intellect is an engine designed to discover physical laws and conquer the forces of nature. In the textual vocabulary, these forces of nature, the raw, physical powers of the universe, are metaphorically referred to as malaika, or angels.
Oh, wait, really? So when ancient texts talk about humanity subduing or commanding angels, they aren't talking about winged beings in the clouds.
Not according to this interpretation, no.
They're talking about humanity mastering physics, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, splitting the atom.
The conquest of the physical universe through empirical science. The human intellect is fully capable of this, but the sources issue a profound warning. Scientific mastery alone is incredibly dangerous.
Because the intellect can tell you how to split the atom, but it doesn't intrinsically tell you why you shouldn't drop it on a city.
Precisely. Divorcing immense scientific power from a unified moral framework breeds destructive materialism. If you have a society operating on the fragmented, selfish economic models we discussed earlier, and you hand them apocalyptic weapons and advanced artificial intelligence,
The natural outcome is massive exploitation, catastrophic wars, and eventual self-destruction.
right, the intellect creates the tool, but the flawed naps uses it to kill.
But the text argues that the reverse is just as catastrophic, right?
Yes. Isolating religion from science, relying purely on passive monasticism, retreating into caves, and ignoring the physical universe results in societal subjugation.
How so?
The authors reference historical conflicts, like the Church persecuting Galileo, to show what happens when passive, dogmatic religion fights objective scientific truth. It stunts human progress, leaves the society vulnerable to those who have mastered science, and leads to national humiliation.
But the Quran, as interpreted by these authors, actively demands the opposite of the Galileo trial.
It does. The texts highlight verses 3.190 and 191, where the Quran explicitly appeals to ulu al-albab, which translates to people of intellect, people of understanding.
Yeah.
The text demands that they reflect deeply on the creation of the heavens and the earth. It is a divine mandate for empirical research, astronomy, and physics.
This raises a massive philosophical question, though. I mean, if we possess this incredible intellect and we are mandated to use it to conquer the physical universe, why do we even need the revelation? Why can't we just use our massive evolving brains to deduce the correct moral laws, too?
That is the ultimate question, and the authors provide a staggering answer. They argue that revelation exists to economize human effort.
Economize human effort. Unpack the mechanism of that.
Think about the methodology of science. It operates on trial and error. We form a hypothesis, we test it, it fails, we adjust, we try again.
Right.
That is an incredibly effective way to learn how to build a bridge or design an airplane. But applying the trial and error method to the foundational moral and structural laws of human society is horrifyingly expensive.
Because the errors in the societal experiment aren't just failed bridge models. The errors are millions of human lives.
Exactly. If humanity tried to figure out that slavery is economically and socially destructive purely through trial and error, it takes millennia of unimaginable suffering to reach a consensus.
Yeah.
If we use trial and error to figure out that hypercapitalism disintegrates the human personality, we have to endure centuries of poverty, psychological burnout, and world wars just to eventually realize, oh, perhaps selflessness and wealth circulation are better.
The cost of the data is paid in blood.
It is. So revelation, the authors argue, is the ultimate divine shortcut. It provides the permanent values, truth, honesty, trust, selflessness, honor directly from the source. It gives humanity the baseline objective code, saving the intellect from endless bloody stumbling.
Wow.
It establishes the moral guardrails required to guide our immense scientific power safely, allowing us to build that heavenly society without accidentally exterminating ourselves in the process.
What a monumental way to look at human history.
Yeah.
Let's take a breath and, survey the landscape we've just traversed. We began by looking at Surah Aal-e-Imran, not as a dusty list of private rituals, but as a sweeping radical manifesto for a unified Deen, a comprehensive socio-economic and political operating system.
Right, a total structural blueprint.
We examined the dual nourishment required for human existence. sustaining the biological body with material food, while actively feeding the nafs with the permanent values of truth and selflessness.
We unpacked the absolute necessity of Nizam-e-Rubaiyat, an economic system based on the continuous flow of surplus wealth to nourish all citizens, violently rejecting the hoarding and usury that shackled humanity.
We confronted the terrifying accountability of mukafat-e-amal, rejecting the comforting blanket of fatalism and embracing the proactive law of cause and effect, where real trust requires relentless practical struggle.
We saw how a true constitutional system must outlive its leaders, demanding collective intellect and enforcing absolute equality.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate synthesis: humanity conquering the physical forces of the universe through science, guided safely past self-destruction by the objective moral shortcut of divine revelation.
It is a relentlessly cohesive framework. It leaves absolutely no room for passive observance. It demands active participation at every single level of reality.
And so, to you, the learner, listening to this deep dive, why does a philosophical analysis of a text from centuries ago matter to your life right now? Because whether you agree with the theology of these authors or violently disagree with their politics, the structural framework they present forces us to look in the mirror and audit the operating systems we are currently running.
It challenges us to stop viewing systemic rot as a minor glitch and start addressing the foundational architecture of our lives.
Exactly. Are we sitting back, paralyzed by fatalism, passively hoping that the universe or the government or the market will magically fix our crises? Or are we engaging in the relentless practical struggle demanded by the laws of cause and effect? Are we hoarding our resources, our wealth, our energy, our empathy out of paranoid fear, building shackling collars around our own necks? Or are we finding ways to keep those resources flowing to nourish the communities around us? Are we only obsessing over the comfort of our biological hardware? Or are we doing the grueling, sacrificial work required to feed our inner selves with honesty and selflessness?
Those are the questions that actually matter.
Which brings me back to the thought we opened with. If we accept the premise that a framework like this was intended to act as a shortcut, a massive software upgrade designed to save humanity from thousands of years of painful trial and error, what modern global crises, what wars, what ecological disasters could we actually solve tomorrow if we finally committed to running a unified, objective, moral operating system instead of endlessly rebooting the same fragmented, subjective ideologies? Keep exploring the code, keep questioning the system, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.